Om Stapakaya Dharmasya Sarvadharma Swarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. Om. Obeisance and salutations unto thee, O Ramakrishna. You who are established in the modern Dharma on this earth, personification of all religions and best among incarnations. So greetings to everybody. This is a special talk to celebrate the life and teachings of the very great and wondrous Swami Adbhutananda. Swami Adbhutananda, whose given name was Raktu Ram, that is the one who is protected by the Lord, in this case Rama. And so we don't know very much about, and we may call him Latu Maharaj from here on, and we can explore how he got that name of endearment. But unlike most of the apostles of Sri Ramakrishna, Latu Maharaj was very unique in two ways. Firstly, we know very little about his childhood background, other than he was born somewhere in Bihar. We know that it was full moon of this period. That's why we celebrate his birthday today. But other than that, we can only infer that he had siblings who never survived. And so there was a mother's prayer, may this one be protected. And of course, Latu Maharaj, of course, was a great devotee of Rama and Ramakrishna, of course. But I always remember now going to Varanasi, the Nivedita ashram. It is the only ashram in the Ramakrishna Matan mission that has a shrine to Hanuman. And it was done specifically for Latu Maharaj, who stayed there. And I think that's very significant because for me, it characterizes the embodiment of what was the servant, Latu Maharaj. When you say servant, I'm not saying in a derogatory way. I'm saying setting up a master-servant relationship. And the family circumstances would have brought Latu Maharaj to Kolkata eventually with his uncle. It seems that about the age of 5, both his parents had died, and his uncle brought him up. He was born in poverty. He was born in rural Bihar, that is, as a shepherd boy is often how it's described. And rural, and the second uniqueness was, of course, he was not educated in any way, shape, or form. And so this was a great benefit to him. It was Swami Purnananda who said we were, all of us meaning the young boys that came, gathered around Ramakrishna and led a monastic life in the future. And they were in some way cluttered. They were cluttered with education and book learning. And one of the beautiful glories of Latu Maharaj is he had none of these diversions and disturbances. That was quite a wonder because even in the days of the Baranagon monastery, that is when Sri Ramakrishna had passed away, then at least the others had some diversion from constant meditation, and at least they could read something or study something. But Latu Maharaj could not do it. So Raktu Ram eventually took service, as many do, and he took service with Ramchandra Datta, who was a great, great devotee of Ramakrishna. His job was to do various things, do errands, get vegetables, things like that. And he was a very, very loyal and very, very diligent servant. But he had a certain feistiness among him as well. And like many people, many rural people, he built his strength up through the hobby of wrestling. It came to Ramchandra Datta's ears that this was not a great advantage. because if you have somebody, a young boy like that, wrestling, he requires more food. And then that's a burden on the master. But of course, Ramchandra was as loyal to Latu. Latu, his name was transferred basically from Raktu. And Lal is basically a term of endearment, meaning a child or something of that nature, a sweet entity. And so he was it came to be Lali, and eventually Lalu, and eventually Latu. This young boy who was uneducated was a wonder, and his name of Adbhutananda shows it. He has the bliss of some miraculous wonder which is there, no doubt the name given by Swami Vivekananda. And Adbhutananda, as we'll call him now, was greatly, greatly devoted to Lauren, as he used to call him. How he came into the environment of Sri Ramakrishna is, of course, a tale of divine grace. Hearing all about the master from Ramchandra Dutt, he was eager and anxious and yearning to see Sri Ramakrishna. And so it was that at one point, Ramchandra Datta was going to go and visit Ramakrishna, and he begged him, "Can I please come with you?" So the first meeting is recorded in a beautiful style, and also shows the way in which these meetings come along. At the very first meeting, Ramakrishna understood the special nature and the destiny of this young boy, commenting that he had the whole character and personality of a sadhu, of a holy person, a saint, from the very beginning. There's a description of a meeting like this. Thakur, that means Sri Ramakrishna, had reached the veranda, and he asked Ram Babu, "Is it you has brought this boy? Where did you get him? He has characteristics of a sadhu." What took place inside a room then, from there on, we had the good fortune to know direct from Ram Babu himself. And one day, in course of his discourse about the wonderful powers Sri Ramakrishna had, Ram Babu gave out this following story. He says, "When I was bowing down to a sadhu, having no marks of a sadhu or a gentleman around him, what thoughts or feelings came to Laltu's mind? And I don't know," he says. "And the moment I got up after bowing down to Sri Ramakrishna, I found him catching hold of the Lord's feet," that's Ramakrishna's feet, "and placing his head on them. And Thakur started talking to me as if he didn't take any notice of the boy. But Laltu, however, got up and stood in front of him with folded palms, all the while drinking in his words. And Thakur, as usual, was smiling and talking, but now and then casting his eyes on Laltu. He said, 'Sit down. Why are you not sitting?' Our talk in the meantime touched the topic of a category of jivas who are ever free and never come under the clutches of Maya. And he stated, these eternally free souls, through all their incarnations, never lose sight of their true nature. They never lose sight of their relation with the Lord of the universe. They are like a fountain whose mouth has been blocked by a stone. A mason, seeing the mouth, removes the stone, and immediately water gushes out beautifully." It's a wonderful, striking image. If debris is put onto these old fountains and suppressing the water, when you remove the debris, these fountains of water spring out again. And this is how he saw this great young boy. And so in saying this, Ramakrishna all on a sudden touched Laltu, indicating the association with it. And at once there was a tremendous welling up of emotions in the boy. And he lost all consciousness of his body and the world outside It seemed as if he had been transported to an unknown region, the region unknown to us, and all the hairs of his body stood on end. His voice was broken and inarticulate, and there was an incessant flow of tears down his cheeks. His lips were quivering violently, and with mouth agape in wonder at this unprecedented surge of emotion in Laltu, Ram Babu says, I was simply paralyzed. When, however, I found Laltu went on crying in that state with no sign of abating, I came to myself and interceded with the Master. That is true, I have no doubt about what you have demonstrated. But would the boy go on crying non-stop in that way? At this, Ramakrishna touched the boy again, and in the twinkling of an eye, the boy, who was sobbing so violently, came round. And still, you will not believe in the superhuman powers of the Lord. Will you not still believe that he is an incarnation of God, says Ramchandra Datta. Ramchandra Datta, along with Girish Chandra Ghosh and Latu, never had any doubt about the special birth of Sri Ramakrishna as what we call divine incarnation. But Latu's loyalty, not loyalty, his yearning initially for Ramakrishna and his devotion was unparalleled. As soon as he wanted to live there with Ramakrishna in Dakshinaswar, Ramakrishna said, no, it's not the time necessarily right now, because he wanted to leave the service of Ramchandra Datta. And because he had found no interest in that work, Ramakrishna's advice was practical and sound. It's an advice for all of us. No, go back, do your duty. Serve Ram with all due diligence and all love, and do your duty properly, mindfully, is what we say today. Because Ramakrishna was going away to his home place, Karmapuka, for some 8 months, as was his wont from time to time. And the young boy pined away. But he still went to Dakshinaswar. When he went to Dakshinaswar, at one point, he had this great vision of Ramakrishna, so real to him that it wasn't so much a vision as a reality, to the point where he asked, oh, where did the Paramahansa go? And he was told, no, he's not here. He's gone to his home place in Karmarpuka. And then realizing that there was no material and physical presence there, he said, well, of course, he's everywhere, isn't he not? And he realized that he had this very special vision. So Latu was a mystic, and he would spend most of his time in japa and meditation. Once Ramakrishna found him a little sleepy, and sleeping actually at the time of the evening arti, and he said, why are you sleeping at this time of night or this time of evening? If you sleep all the while away, when will you do your spiritual practice? When will you meditate? And the literalness of his guru was such that for the rest of his whole life, he made sure that he never slept. Only maybe a few moments in the morning and a few moments in the afternoon. But otherwise, he made it his life rule. If you ask what was Swami Adbhutananda's great teaching, more than anybody else, he seemed to have emphasized the importance of japa, continuously repeating God's name. He was challenged on this because somebody once said, you know, how can we love God? We can't see him. We have no physical understanding of such an entity. But then you see, he gave this wonderful, profound answer. He said, you know, if you make an application to a government office, then you don't know who the officer is. Still, you make your application. And the point is that when you become used to this word, to this name of God, just by repeating the name of God, it becomes a habitual part of you and becomes a yielding thing for the vision of God. And he was proof, living proof of this. So he was he became a most profound saint. It was a wonder in his later life how he could explain things that he had never read, such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and so on. And he would give absolutely pristine commentaries and explanations of what was being read. He would reflect and he would say, yes, that's correct, from his own inner experience. And this is what makes him such a miracle, such a wonder, so aptly named Adbhutananda, that indicates this. So he was the absolute attendant. When Ramakrishna came back from Kamarapura, it so happened that Hazra, his normal attendant, had some unfortunately misunderstanding with the authorities. He had to be sent away. He couldn't be protected. And that was the right timing. And so Ramchandra Datta readily agreed, yes, he can assist you and he can serve you. At some point, one incident was that Ramakrishna had asked him to go and take his prasad from the Vaishnavite side of things, from the Vishnu temple, which was there in the same complex as Dakshinaswar. Kali temple, Vishnu temple is there as well. And Shiva temples are also there. And each will have their individual prasad. Knowing that he came from rural Bihar, he was sure that it would be vegetarian food and that that would suit him. But in typical independence and boldness, he said, no, no, no. I rather take whatever you eat, you give me a little of that, and that would be my prasad. In terms of food, he needed very little. He was almost unaware of food. There were times when he wasn't aware whether he ate or not. In terms of his needs, very few. When he was living at the house of Balaram Bose, where he had a small room there, the room was pretty much bare, nothing there, just a small stove with a kettle for tea. I love Latu very much on two accounts. He's a bearded Swami, and secondly, of course, he loves his tea. So this was a life of a real sadhu. And at moments when he wanted to, he could meditate anywhere. And he would never really go, or not consciously go. On occasion, of course, he would, beyond the 5 kilometer or 5 mile, I should say, range around Dakshinaswar. And he would much prefer to stay in devotees' houses. He had two prayers, really. One prayer was that he should find the opportunity to continuously meditate without the wandering of a sadhu, going here and going there, without that kind of disturbance. And secondly, that he have a strong digestion. When he was asked about the second request, he said, well, you see, sadhus are given all kinds of food. You have no control over what is given. And so it's necessary for us to have a very strong digestion. And he himself was a strong and hardy person. But really, he spent his whole life as a dedicated servant of God, like Hanuman to Rama. And he also regarded Holy Mother not only as Lakshmi, but also as Sita. And so we can see there the relationship between Hanuman, Rama, and Sita all together. It is more than, to me, more than a coincidence that he had this dedication and that he posed himself as Hanuman, and that he had this great devotion to Hanuman. Even his old master, Ramchandra Datta, he himself, although he never engaged actively like the others in Swami Vivekananda's social work, still, when Ramchandra Datta was in his last moments, he nursed him to the very last. And he did the same for his for Ramchandra Datta's wife as well, in reparation, if you will, for the way and beautiful way that they had taken him and treated him. But he was no pushover, and he would speak his mind. There was once where he was on an accompanying pilgrimage with Swami Vivekananda, and there Vivekananda had mentioned that a certain shrine was several thousand years old, and Latu Maharaj challenged him on it. He said, "How do you know this?" And dismissively, Vivekananda said, "Oh, it's difficult to explain somebody of your, lack of education," words to that effect. And Latu Maharaj said, "Well, if you can't explain to a simple-minded person like me with no education, then I'm not sure how wise you actually are," that kind of thing. But he was straight. He said, "Well, such is your wisdom that you cannot enlighten an illiterate person like myself." And of course, it gave rise to a considerable humor because there was no malice in it, simply straightforwardness. He was a person who, from afar, looked a little grim, a little remote, because he hid all his spiritual wealth was hidden from others. He was described as laid back and gruff, but he was actually far from that, because when you went closer to him, you saw that inside was all soft love. And he gave the most marvelous attention to those who had difficulties and problems, giving them the right solution. His wisdom was phenomenal. And that is why Swami Vivekananda, playing on the word Latu, Leto, Plato, he said, he called him jokingly Plato, some insight into his wisdom. In terms of the science of religion, and it's a question we get asked very often, what scriptures have you read? What books have you read? Of course, the key scripture universally in Vedanta would be the Bhagavad Gita. So simple, so profound, and so practical. And very often I ask, well, have you picked up the Bhagavad Gita? They say, "Oh, yes, I've read that." My answer is invariably, well, have you studied it? And of course, this is what Latu Maharaj has to say. Worldly people cannot understand the Gita because without renunciation, the essence of the Gita cannot be understood. What a remarkably insightful commentary on the capacity and the competence to read a scripture, particularly the Bhagavad Gita. And then because he used to listen very closely to everything the master said. And everything the master said was absolutely literal. And he'd had enough experience massaging the master's feet and many, many instances where he would have been given this tremendous privilege of samadhi, a very natural thing for him. And of course, in the Bhagavad Gita, we are told what is night to a yogi is day. And so day and night are alternated in terms of a yogi and a non-yogi. And so in the Baranago Mutt, there was a rattling at night, sufficient to awaken Swami Sharananda, who thought there was some rats probably present. And he struck a lamp to look around. And of course, it was the rustling of Latu Maharaj telling his beads at night, in the dead of night. He had been caught out, as it were, in this secretive activity. Wonderful, wonderful example of when you pray to your Father who is in heaven, pray in secret. And that was more or less a saying from Jesus. Not to boast about all your spiritual accomplishments, but certainly he would have had this Nirvikalpa Samadhi, where he was later able to describe in his beautiful, simple way, and yet so profound. I tasted that which was beyond taste. And he goes on in that vein. And so what a wonderful enrichment, total enrichment of experience, all through the Master's grace. It was a Master who tried to teach him every aspect of life. When the Master taught, the Master, Sri Ramakrishna, would give an all-round education, both from a secular, practical point of view and from a spiritual point of view. Great example of that would have been Holy Mother, where he taught her how to trim a lamp and how to behave in certain company and all of these things. And the mother would have said, and he taught me Samadhi. So the essence of the Gita is what Latu Maharaj was getting at. Is that the Master used to say that by repeating the words Gita, Gita 10 times, one receives the same result as one gets from reading the Gita. The real import of the Gita cannot rightly be understood if one has no sadhana, because you see, the Master used to say the purport of the Gita is when you rapidly say it and it becomes tagi, 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 indicating renunciation. And so he mentions this in one's heart. If one does not practice disciplines, then what does the Gita say? It says tyaga, tyaga, renunciation, renunciation, within and without. And if one does not observe celibacy or engage in sadhana, this idea does not solidify. Gita, Gita, tyagi, tyagi, think on this. Then only the meaning of the Gita will be revealed to you. It is remarkable that all of the monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna held a certain spark, if you will, of the totality of Sri Ramakrishna. And in terms of Latu Maharaj, he encompassed the simplicity, the childlike nature, the innocence, the lack of ego. One great instruction to him from the Master was, be pure in mind, make sure that there is absolutely no dirt. Dirt was the Master's expression for egoism. Make sure that there is no ego in anything. Be humble. And there could be no more humble entity than Latu Maharaj. Of course, he served the mother, and even in Ramakrishna's lifetime, he was sitting meditating on one of the ghats, and the Master came to him and said, what is all this? You're meditating here, but the mother, she's struggling. And so you go and help her. And he took him there. And he was one of the few, one out of three, who could, with ease, be close to the mother, because he had the nature of a child. He said, this boy is absolutely sattvic, and he will help you. And then he became the dedicated servant of the mother also. He became so close to the Divine Holy Mother. And in some so-called contradictory statements about the mother, it was because he could not understand how people could not register her as pure Lakshmi, how she was so underrated in his eyes, and how much love and affection he had, and how difficult it was for them to part. When the Holy Mother visited Balaram Bo's house where Latu Maharaj was staying, and she was about to depart for her Jarampati, and she thought, I have to say goodbye to Latu Maharaj. So she goes to his room that was on the ground floor, and standing at the door, he recognizes her and he becomes appalled. He says, you can imagine his absolute apoplexy at this instant, because he says, you, Queen of the Universe, should be summoning me from your room. Please go there and summon me and I will come. See the great humility, wisdom, uncluttered nature, and a deep and profound capacity to meditate. This could summarize Latu Maharaj. In his end days, he suffered greatly, and he had to be operated on a number of times. But he remained completely calm. And one characteristic is this, that when the end eventually came in 1920, April 1920, they say that his face was radiating complete bliss. And when he had entered into this Mahasamadhi, you couldn't tell whether he was alive or dead because his face was so serene and beaming. What a beautiful conclusion to his life. But his frankness was a wonderful, wonderful trait he had. And he couldn't tolerate idle talk either. And he would say so. And it wouldn't matter if it was to his Guru Bhais, his brother monks, or to anybody else. He was extremely frank. It's recalled that this frankness, in fact, it was Mahendranath Gupta M, who recalls like this. He says, on occasions where he has to take an independent stance, he says he took the pose of a wrestler, and his stiff, straight neck turned a little towards the object of his criticism, his chin a little raised, his eyes wide and open, with shooting fire, walls of the nostrils considerably swollen, fingers closely joined in a fist, and his words gushing out in stubborn half Bengali and half Patwa of Chapra would paralyze his target to complete silence. And in later life, of course, these traits became all the more prominent. And never did he rather, could he like flattery words, sweet words of flattery. There's a famous dialogue between him and Brahmachari, who flatters him as a spiritual, in a genuine way, he's intending to elevate him. You know, people want to write his life and so on and so forth, and he demurs on every occasion. And then he turns around on them and says, you get out of here, you're a flatterer. That kind of attitude. So this is the great Latu Maharaj. His meditation was legendary. He would often find a place anywhere, taking refuge for a little solitude. Sometimes he'd find himself in an empty railway truck, and going into a state of high meditative states, he would find himself drawn by the carriages far away from where he started. On one occasion, he went into a boat, and knowing that they would load the boat with hay, he was able to calculate it'll take quite a bit of time for them to do this, so I'll be safe. But he was so completely oblivious to what was going on, and the whole consignment was loaded onto the boat, and he found himself in the middle of the river, about 12 miles from Kolkata, and he had to ask the boatman, eventually, please bring me into the shore, and he walked the 12 miles back. He was also a nonconformist. Now, I know in spiritual life, we all say that steady practice is necessary and a regular routine is helpful. But his character didn't help at all. Such an advanced state he was. His eating habits would be erratic. When he was stayed in the devotee's house, say Balaram Bose's, sometimes he would eat at 1 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 3 o'clock, sometimes all did at different odd hours of the day. And when Swami Vivekananda introduced the law, a rule that on the ringing of the bell in the morning, everyone should get up and meditate. The following day, Latu Maharaj was on his way out. Swami Vivekananda, hearing of this, managed to catch him. He says, look, my mind isn't advanced enough. See the humility. My mind isn't advanced enough that at the mere ringing of your bell, it can go into meditation. And of course, the exemption was made. So this is the remarkable life of a great saint. Now, there are many sources for all this information. I have quoted variously from different places. One place would be this Eternal Words is what it's called, which is some of the great teachings on many different varied subjects. And virtually any difficulty you have in spiritual life, you can look under the category and see what Latu Maharaj has had to say. Another would have been Swami Adbhutananda as we saw him. And this is a remarkable, insightful text gathered from various sources and compiled and translated. And then, of course, there are the normal standard texts that we can use. That is, God Lived With Them by Swami Chetananda, who's gathered from all these sources comprehensively. And of course, that summary, that overview look, which is laid out in Swami Gambhirananda's book, The Apostles of Ramakrishna, also extended into a book called The Disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. So it would be wonderful, having gotten a taste of this, to do a little research in order to get the inspiration. The reason why we study the lives of these amazingly wonderful and high impact and unique saints is that they can inspire our own life and our own spiritual practice. And that if one or two people can reach the highest plane of consciousness, then we too have the capacity to do it. And particularly as we have the eternally flowing grace of Sri Ramakrishna. One great characteristic of Latu Maharaj and the key to his whole spiritual life was his devotion to Sri Ramakrishna, unwavering devotion to Ramakrishna, both physically, both emotionally, and even whether Ramakrishna was alive or whether he had gone beyond his Mahasamadhi, still Latu Maharaj felt this close connection, this eternal presence of his master, Sri Ramakrishna. So with these few words, we leave you at that, and we think now and contemplate today on the life and teachings of Swami Adbhutananda, Latu Maharaj. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.